It was Toronto's greatest tragedy. Today we're taking a look back at the fire on the SS Noronic and the 118 people that died. I've always thought it a bit odd that an event as large and tragic in the city's fairly recent history has gone so under-discussed. But I believe there are three main reasons for this. 1. All the fatalities were American except one. 2. It happened shortly after the trauma of World War II. And 3. The cowardice of the Canadian crew. Now let me be clear, many Torontonians, including the police, fire, and passerbys, stepped up and saved countless lives. But the crew of the Canadian ship itself arguably failed, and badly. Here are some photos of the ship in the decades prior to the tragedy. In September of 1949, Captain William Taylor departed with his large passenger ship from Detroit, Michigan, on a 7-day voyage of Lake Ontario. They would stop briefly in Cleveland, Ohio, before heading east towards Prescott, Ontario. On the evening of September 16th, the large ship would dock at Pier 9 in Toronto, right here, waiting to depart the following morning. Now, these are roughly the known facts of what happened. At 2:30 a.m. on September 17th, a deckhand would smell smoke on the sea deck of the ship. A small fire, likely from a discarded cigarette, had started in a linen closet. When the door opened, flames exploded outward and began to engulf the ship. This led to failure number 1. You see, the ship's wooden floors were painted with flammable lemon oil polished walls, igniting the fire even further. By 2:38, the ship's captain had been notified. The alarm sounded and people were already dying. This leads to another failure. No fire extinguishers aboard the ship were working. As the fire spread through the large ship, its 600 passengers, almost entirely American, were desperately trying to flee. But for most of them, this would be futile. Which leads us to another failure. You could only exit the ship from one level. A good portion of the crew had stayed ashore for the night, but the few dozen that had stayed knew how to flee, and by all accounts, most of them fled, which leads us to yet another failure, the apparent cowardice of the crew. Many of them didn't even help the trapped American passengers. Apparently, they didn't even call the fire department once off the ship. By 2:41, the first Toronto fire truck had arrived, joining a small group of police officers and Good Samaritans, many of whom had already dove into the water trying to rescue the passengers. The heroic Toronto police officers, firefighters, and civilians at the gruesome scene saved countless lives that night. Because of their heroism, only one person died by drowning. Most of the 117 others died from smoke inhalation, burning, while others died by falling from the boat from too high. Others trampled to death. Now, the death toll of 118 is only an estimate. Some accounts by the city estimated as many as 139. Another aspect, which leads to the unprofessionalism of the ship company's records. In the days following, the hundreds of bodies were taken to the C&E grounds, many of the bodies only being able to be identified through dental records. The event shook both the US and Canada and led to numerous new safety regulations following, things that could have saved the 118 poor souls that died in that tragic event in 1949. As I said, I've always found it interesting how little is commonly known about this tragedy. But I think the reason perhaps shadows why people don't talk about the loss of life from the Spanish flu in 1918 to 1920. The fact that it followed a war and the trauma from those wars.